Hayes grabbed the scoring board and slammed it down on the console so hard the entire range went quiet. "Someone tell me," he shouted, his voice cutting across every conversation on that firing line, "why this woman is standing next to operators who have been bleeding on battlefields while she was still in a classroom." 60 soldiers heard every word. Some looked away. Nobody defended her. Sarah Mitchell stood completely still, her weapon at her side, her eyes forward, her face carrying absolutely nothing. Hayes stepped closer. "Prove it," he said. "Right now, in front of everyone." She walked to the line, without a single word raised her weapon, and answered him with 5 perfect shots. The last one at 98 meters, a target Hayes had secretly configured to destroy her. When it dropped, nobody laughed anymore. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Sarah Mitchell had learned how to count silence, not the comfortable kind that settles over a room after a long day. Not the peaceful kind that comes when an argument finally ends. She had learned to count the particular silence that follows a public humiliation. The kind where everyone around you hears the insult, absorbs it, processes it, and then chooses to say absolutely nothing. That silence, she had discovered, lasted exactly as long as it took for the humiliated person to either collapse or collect themselves. She had never once collapsed. She stood at her assigned position on the firing line at Fort Raven Tactical Academy and listened to Victor Hayes finish his sentence. She heard the low exhale from the soldier 2 positions to her left, a sound that was halfway between a laugh and an attempt to disguise one. She heard the scrape of boots on the concrete platform behind her as someone shifted their weight, suddenly uncomfortable with being present for what they assumed was about to become a very unpleasant scene. She did not turn around. She did not look at Hayes. She looked at the target board 60 meters downrange and went through her breathing sequence, the way she had been trained to do it. Not as a calming technique, not as an emotional regulation tool, but as a mechanical reset. Inhale on the count of 4. Hold on the count of 4. Exhale on the count of 6. She had done it so many times that it required no conscious thought. Her body knew the sequence the way a pianist knows a scale. The Advanced Combat Accuracy Assessment had been running at Fort Raven for 11 years. It was not on paper the most prestigious marksmanship competition the military offered. There were national-level events with larger audiences and more formal scoring committees. But within the tactical community, the ACAA carried a specific reputation. It was designed by people who understood that hitting a stationary paper target in perfect conditions told you almost nothing about a shooter. The ACAA was built to test something harder, to measure the ability to maintain mechanical precision when everything around you was actively trying to destroy your focus. The range was engineered for disruption. Acoustic disturbances arrived without warning. The sudden crack of a secondary percussion charge, the bark of recorded gunfire from adjacent speakers, a timed burst of white noise that hit at intervals designed by a psychologist to coincide with the moment a shooter's concentration was deepest. The targets moved. Not in predictable arcs, but in irregular patterns that required a shooter to relearn the movement with every new problem set. The lighting shifted. The time windows for engagement were randomized within parameters that made it impossible to anticipate exactly when the window would open. In 11 years, 17 shooters had posted perfect scores on the full assessment. All 17 were men. 15 of them had combat deployments. The remaining 2 had accumulated more range time between them than most full units saw in a decade. This information was not hidden. It was not presented as a warning or a gatekeeping device. It was simply the history of the event, and it sat in every briefing packet distributed to all participants the morning before the assessment began. Sarah had read it at 04:30 in the small room she had been assigned at the temporary quarters building on the eastern end of the installation. She had read it the same way she read everything systematically, without allowing herself to react to any individual piece of information until she had taken in the full context. She did not find the statistics discouraging. She found them interesting. There were 43 participants registered for this year's ACAA. They came from 7 different units. The range of experience represented was significant from a master sergeant with 23 years of service and 2 combat tours to a staff sergeant with 4 years in who had posted exceptional scores at the unit level and been nominated by his battalion commander. The majority fell somewhere in the middle. Experienced professionals who were good at what they did and who had prepared seriously for this assessment. Sarah had been nominated by Colonel Denise Ware, the commanding officer of the specialized unit Sarah had been assigned to for the previous 18 months. Colonel Ware had submitted the nomination paperwork with a brief recommendation letter that was specific and measured in its language, the way Colonel Ware was specific and measured about everything. The letter did not make extravagant claims. It did not attempt to distinguish Sarah from the other nominees with superlatives. It described, in concrete terms, what Sarah had demonstrated in the program under Colonel Ware's command, and it recommended her for the assessment on those grounds. What the letter did not include, what could not be included in any unclassified nomination document, was the other half of Sarah's record. The part that existed in a different system with different access requirements, visible only to people with the appropriate clearance and a specific need to know. That record was not available in the briefing packet. It was not visible to the other 42 participants. It was not visible to the range staff, the scoring officials, or most of the instructors who would be running the assessment. Victor Hayes had not seen it. This was something Sarah knew and had thought about carefully in the weeks before the assessment. She had considered whether to request that some portion of the relevant information be made available through appropriate channels to the range director to avoid exactly the kind of situation that was now unfolding. She had decided against it. Her reasoning was straightforward. If her performance required prior context to be understood as legitimate, then it was not legitimate enough. She would either demonstrate what she was capable of inside the assessment itself, or the assessment results would stand as they stood. She had arrived at Fort Raven the previous afternoon. She had checked in, collected her materials, found her room, and spent the evening reviewing the assessment format one more time. Not because she needed to, but because reviewing the materials one final time before a significant event was part of her preparation process, and she did not skip steps in her preparation process. She had eaten dinner alone in the facility cafeteria. 3 soldiers at an adjacent table had recognized her as a new face and spent approximately 4 minutes debating in voices just loud enough to carry whether her presence at the ACAA was a diversity thing or whether she had actually qualified through the normal channels. One of them concluded that it didn't matter because the assessment would sort it out quickly enough. She had finished her meal and gone to bed at 2100. She had slept without difficulty. She woke at 400 without an alarm the way she always did. Now she was standing on the firing line, and Victor Hayes was making a point, and the entire range was absorbing it, and she was counting the silence. Lieutenant Mitchell. The voice belonged to the range director, Major Calvin Ford. He was standing at the scoring station 20 meters back from the firing line, and his tone was the carefully neutral tone of a man who had spent 15 years in the military learning to manage situations that could go sideways. The pre-qualification block begins in 4 minutes, Major Ford said. Participants should be staged and ready. It was not a reprimand. It was not a defense of Sarah. It was an instruction that gave everyone present. Hayes included a clear action to execute that required them to stop doing what they were currently doing. Major Ford had done this before. Hayes held the eye contact he had with the commander for one more beat. Then he turned to his position on the observation platform with the measured deliberateness of a man who was not finished, but who had chosen to pause. Sarah exhaled through the count of 6 and looked downrange. The first problem set arrived 7 minutes later. It was calibration, a standard accuracy confirmation that every participant ran before the scored portions of the assessment began. 4 targets at known distances, standard exposure times, no environmental interference. The purpose was to establish baseline data and allow the scoring system to confirm that all equipment was functioning correctly. Sarah ran the calibration block in 41 seconds. All 4 targets center mass inside the scoring ring. This was not unusual. Most of the experienced shooters ran clean calibrations. The calibration block was not designed to discriminate between participants. It was designed to confirm readiness. A shooter who struggled in calibration had a problem that needed to be addressed before they competed. But the shooter to Sarah's right, a staff sergeant named Delaney, who had been friendly and professional during the morning briefing, glanced sideways at her after she finished and gave a small nod. "Clean," he said quietly. "Same to you," Sarah said. Delaney's calibration had been clean too. He had the manner of someone who was genuinely competitive, but who had no interest in anything outside of the performance itself. Sarah had noticed him at the morning briefing. He had been one of the few people who looked at her directly when Colonel Ware's name was mentioned during the introduction of participants, as if the name meant something to him and he was filing it for consideration. The scored portion of the assessment began with the first moving target sequence. The targets appeared at 3 different ranges simultaneously. They moved in the irregular pattern Sarah had reviewed in the materials. The exposure window was randomized within the 40 to 60-second range. The acoustic disturbances, the percussion charges, the speaker bursts, the white noise began as soon as the targets appeared. Sarah engaged. She did not think about Hayes. She did not think about the soldiers who had laughed. She did not think about the classified record that sat in a locked system somewhere and that could not be seen by anyone on this range. She thought about the problem in front of her: 3 targets, 3 engagement solutions, environmental interference, time window. She processed the movement patterns for each target, calculated the lead distance on the moving elements, and began working through the problem, set the same way she always did, not quickly, but correctly. The sequence ended. The scoring system processed the results. Sarah heard the data come up on the display behind the firing line and knew from the silence that followed that her scores had landed somewhere unexpected. Not because she had been extraordinary. The first sequence was not designed to produce extraordinary scores, but because the scores were clean. Clean in the way that a very specific kind of preparation produces. Not lucky, not aggressive, systematic, solid. Delaney said more quietly this time. She didn't respond. The second sequence was loading. The second sequence was harder. The pattern of target movement was denser, with overlapping windows that forced a rapid shift between engagement points without the time to fully reset between shots. The acoustic interference in the second sequence included a random vocal element, a recorded voice delivering fragmentary communications, the kind of radio traffic a shooter might hear in an operational environment, layered underneath the mechanical disturbances. It was designed to pull cognitive resources in 2 directions simultaneously. Sarah had trained in environments where the interference was worse. She completed the second sequence without a miss. The silence behind her was different now. It was not the silence of people who were uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who were paying attention. Victor Hayes had moved from the observation platform to a position closer to the scoring display. She knew this, not because she had looked, but because she recognized his voice from a different angle when he spoke to one of the scoring officials in a low, clipped tone. "What's her classification rating?" Hayes asked. "Not in the participant materials, Sergeant Major," the official said. "Can you pull it?" "Not my access level." A pause. "Run the third sequence," Hayes said. The third sequence was where the ACAA assessment historically separated participants into 2 clear groups. It introduced a scenario element, a situation requiring the shooter to make target identification decisions in addition to accuracy decisions. Not every target presented in the third sequence was a legitimate engagement. Some were marked with indicators, specific visual codes attached to the target boards that designated them as non-threat. Engaging a non-threat target in the third sequence cost more than a miss. It was scored as a critical error, and a critical error in the third sequence had eliminated more participants from contention than any other single element of the assessment. The cognitive load in the third sequence was significant. A shooter had to manage the accuracy problem and the identification problem simultaneously, under the same acoustic interference conditions as the first 2 sequences, with the added pressure of knowing that a wrong decision was worse than no decision. Sarah set up for the third sequence. She heard Hayes say something to the scoring official that she didn't catch. Then she heard clearly, "She'll pick up a critical error here. They always do the first time through this format." She noted the statement, filed it, let it pass. The third sequence began. The targets appeared in the irregular pattern. The acoustic interference started. The non-threat indicators were visible. She had trained on this format, knew exactly what to look for, had practiced the dual processing required to manage both decision streams without allowing either to degrade the other. She worked through it. At the 40-second mark, a target appeared at the far right of her engagement zone that carried a non-threat indicator. It was positioned at an angle that made the indicator less visible than the others, a deliberate design choice intended to challenge a shooter who was moving quickly through the problem set. She recognized the indicator, did not engage, moved to the next target. The sequence ended. She heard the scores come up, no critical errors. The silence behind her lasted longer this time. When Hayes spoke, his voice had changed in a way she recognized. She had heard that particular vocal quality before in instructors, in senior operators, in people who had spent years establishing themselves as the definitive authority on a subject when they encountered something that didn't fit their existing framework. It was not anger exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than anger. "Run the scenario again," Hayes said. "Different parameter set." Major Ford's voice. "That's outside the assessment protocol, Sergeant Major. I'm adjusting the evaluation conditions. It's within range director discretion." Ford paused for a moment. "Noted. All participants will run the alternate parameter set on sequence 3. Resetting now." It was technically within the range director's discretion. The CAA protocol allowed for alternate parameter sets to be run if the range director determined that assessment conditions required additional data. It was a provision designed for genuine operational reasons, equipment calibration issues, environmental anomalies, situations where the standard sequence had been compromised. It was not designed for this. But Sarah understood what was happening, and she understood that arguing would accomplish nothing and would shift the focus of the event from her performance to the procedural dispute. She would run the alternate parameter set. She would run it as cleanly as she had run the standard set. The alternate sequence 3 was harder. The non-threat indicators were smaller. The movement pattern was denser. The acoustic interference added a secondary vocal layer that increased the cognitive load significantly. She completed it without a critical error. When the scores came up, she heard someone behind her. Not Hayes, someone else. A voice she didn't recognize say quietly, "What is this woman?" Hayes did not respond to that. He walked from the scoring area to a position directly behind the firing line. Not behind Sarah's position specifically, he stopped in the center of the line, equidistant from all the active shooters. But his attention was not distributed evenly. "The fourth sequence is the last scored block before the final assessment," he announced. "It integrates everything from the first 3. There's no format you haven't seen. There's nothing in sequence 4 that should surprise any experienced shooter." He paused. Experience. That's what decides it. In the fourth sequence, you will see the difference between people who have trained for scenarios like this and people who have been trained in scenarios like this. Those are two different things. It was a careful statement. It didn't name anyone. It didn't need to. Delaney, to Sarah's right, exhaled slowly and very quietly said something under his breath that sounded like it might have been a profanity, but was too low to confirm. The fourth sequence began. This was the sequence Sarah had studied most carefully. Not because it was the hardest, technically it was the most complex, but not the hardest, but because it was the sequence most likely to produce the kind of error that couldn't be explained by a bad day or an equipment issue. The fourth sequence errors tended to be decision errors. Errors produced by fatigue, by accumulated pressure, by the compounding weight of everything that had come before. She had prepared for it specifically. The problem set was dense, 6 engagement points across a wide lateral spread. The targets moved in a pattern she recognized from her preparation, but that was varied enough in execution that she couldn't simply apply a memorized solution. She had to work the actual problem, not the rehearsed version. At the 90-second mark, 2 targets appeared simultaneously at opposite ends of the engagement zone. The standard approach was to prioritize the nearest threat and work outward. But in this specific geometric arrangement, the standard approach produced a timing problem. The far target's exposure window would close before a shooter using the standard approach could reach it. She had seen this geometry in preparation. She had worked out the non-standard solution, the counterintuitive engagement order that preserved both opportunities in training. She executed the non-standard solution. Both targets fell. The sequence ended. The scoring display went up. She heard it before she saw it. The quality of the silence told her. Not the silence of people absorbing a disappointing result. The silence of people looking at a number and recalibrating something they thought they understood. Delaney said, "Sarah." She looked at him. "Where did you train?" he asked. His tone was not challenging. It was genuinely curious, the way a craftsman is curious when he encounters someone else's work and can't immediately identify the tradition it comes from. "Classified program," she said. "Under Colonel Ware." He nodded slowly. "Colonel Denise Ware." "Yes." He nodded again, as if that answered the question and several follow-up questions he hadn't asked yet. Victor Hayes was standing at the scoring display looking at the numbers. From this angle she could see his profile. The particular expression on his face was one she had seen before, not often, but enough to recognize it. It was the expression of a person who had built a very solid structure in their mind, and who was watching in real time as it developed a crack that didn't fit the engineering. He turned from the display. He looked at Sarah directly for the first time since the pre-qualification confrontation. He didn't say anything. She held the eye contact for exactly as long as was natural, then looked back downrange. The final assessment was scheduled for the following morning. Tonight, the participants would be briefed on the format. There would be a dinner in the facility's common room. Most of the experienced operators would spend the evening reviewing their scores, identifying what had worked and what hadn't, adjusting their preparation for tomorrow's final block. Sarah would eat dinner, review her scoring data methodically, and sleep at 2100. But at the briefing that evening, something happened that she had not anticipated. Major Ford read through the day's scores in the order they appeared on the board. When he reached her name, he paused, not for effect, not dramatically, but with the brief pause of a man who was reading a number and verifying it against a second source before announcing it. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said. "Score from today's 4 sequences." Another brief pause. 97.4. The room was quiet. 97.4 was not the highest score ever posted in the ACAA's preliminary rounds, but it was the highest score from any preliminary round in the last 4 years, and it was posted without a single critical error across all 4 sequences, including the alternate parameter run that Hayes had added outside the standard protocol. The room absorbed it. Sergeant Major Victor Hayes was sitting at the far end of the briefing table. His expression was controlled. He was a man who had spent decades in environments where emotional reactions were visible and where visible reactions were information. He had learned to manage what his face communicated. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that was different from the morning. After Ford finished the briefing, Hayes stood up. He walked around the end of the table. He stopped at the position where Sarah was seated. "Lieutenant," he said. "Sergeant Major." He looked at her for a moment, not the dismissive look from the morning, something more careful. "Where did you pick up your trigger control?" he asked. It was a technical question. It was his version of what Delaney had asked, approached from the angle he understood best, the mechanics of the thing, not the person behind it. "Long practice," she said. He studied her. "Under what conditions? The kind that don't go in an unclassified document," she said. Not combatively, simply factually. Another pause. "Tomorrow's final assessment," Hayes said. 5 targets, 1 sequence, no retakes." He paused again. "Nobody's posted a clean 5 from the final block in 3 years." "I know," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded once precisely and walked away. Delaney, who had been sitting 2 seats down and had heard the entire exchange, leaned slightly toward her. "He's not done," Delaney said quietly. "No," Sarah agreed. But he's also not the same as he was this morning. No, she said. He's not. She stacked her briefing material, stood up, and carried her tray to the window. Tomorrow the range would be full. Word had moved through the installation the way word always moves through a tactical unit, selectively quickly, and with the specific emphasis that the person conveying it found most relevant. Some people would come to see the highest preliminary score in 4 years extended to a clean final. Some would come because they didn't believe that was possible. Some would come because they hadn't been present today, and they wanted to understand what they had missed. Victor Hayes would be there. He would be watching with everything he knew about shooting, every year of experience, every system he had built, for understanding what excellence looked like and where it came from. And tomorrow morning, Sarah Mitchell would walk to the firing line and show him something he hadn't built a system to understand yet. She went to her room. She reviewed her data. She slept at 2100. She was awake before the alarm she hadn't set. That was the thing about preparation. At the level Sarah Mitchell operated, it rewired you in ways that went deeper than habit. Her body understood schedules the way a well-maintained instrument understood tension. At 400, something internal and precise clicked over, and she was simply awake, lying in the dark with her eyes open and her mind already running through the sequence she would face in less than 6 hours. She did not review the day before. She did not replay Hayes or the briefing room, or Delaney's quiet observation that Hayes was not the same man he'd been that morning. She had processed all of that before she slept, the same way she processed everything systematically, completely, and then closed. What was done was recorded. What mattered now was what came next. She dressed in the dark and walked to the facility's small gym before anyone else was using it. She did not lift weights. She ran through a movement sequence her coach had designed 3 years ago, specifically for the morning, before high-stakes performance events, not to build anything, but to remind the body of what it already knew. Slow, deliberate movements. Complete control at every point. The kind of exercise that communicated a single message from the brain to the nervous system. We are ready, and we have been ready, and today is only the demonstration of that fact. She was back in her room by 5:20. At 5:45, she heard voices in the hallway outside her door. 2 soldiers. At least she could identify the voices without being able to make out the exact words. The tone was animated. The kind of conversation that people have when they've been thinking about something since the previous evening and have finally found someone to think about it with out loud. She caught Hayes's name. She caught her own. She laced up her boots and didn't listen more carefully than that. The dining facility opened at 0600. She arrived at 0601 and found it already half-populated, which was unusual for a training installation at that hour. People were there early because they wanted to get to the range early, and they wanted to get to the range early because the final assessment block was scheduled for 0900, and nobody wanted to miss the setup. Word had moved through the installation faster than she'd anticipated, which meant it had moved at the speed of a story people found genuinely interesting, rather than the speed of routine operational updates. By 0615, the table dynamic in the dining facility was an observable social fact. People were seated in groupings that reflected where they stood on what was about to happen. The operators who had been present for the previous day's preliminary rounds occupied one cluster. The people who had arrived from adjacent units and had only heard about the scores secondhand occupied another. The range staff moved between both. Delaney found her table at 0622. He set his tray down across from her without asking, which she didn't object to. He had the look of someone who had been awake for a while and had been doing some version of what she'd been doing, running through the sequence, preparing the mind for the day. "You eat before a performance event?" he asked. "Standard breakfast," she said. "Nothing heavy." He nodded. He ate for a moment without speaking. "I looked up Colonel Ware's program last night," he said. "Public record, so whatever I could find." Which wasn't much. "No," Sarah said. "It wouldn't be. The unit designation is there. Some exercise participation data, nothing about what they actually do." "That's intentional." "I figured." He drank his coffee. "Whatever they actually do, it shows up in how you work. I've been shooting at this level for 9 years. I know what trained looks like versus what experienced looks like versus what something else looks like. He paused. You're the something else. She looked at him. I was trained, same as anyone else. Not the same, he said without challenge, just correction. Similar methods maybe, but a different order of magnitude somewhere in there. She didn't confirm or deny it. She finished her eggs and drank her water and thought about the fifth target, the one that had been described in the assessment materials as the final element of the full sequence. The materials described it in general terms, a target designed to challenge shooters who had performed well through the first 4 elements. Distance was not specified. Movement pattern was not specified. The materials noted that the fifth target's parameters were set by the range director on the morning of the final assessment, adjusted to reflect current conditions. This meant Hayes would have input on the fifth target. She had been thinking about this since the previous evening, which was why it had been the last thing she processed before sleep. The fact that Hayes had operational influence over the final element of the assessment was not a problem she could solve in advance. She could only note it, accept it as a variable she couldn't control, and commit fully to executing whatever was presented to her. What she would not do was allow the fact of Hayes's influence to generate anticipatory anxiety that degraded her focus before she even stepped onto the line. She picked up her tray. Good luck today, Delaney said. Same to you, she said. You had a strong day yesterday. I had a good day, he said. You had a strong day. There's a difference. She carried her tray to the window and walked to the range. The observation area at Fort Raven's primary firing complex was designed for an audience of perhaps 60 people. It had been expanded at some point in the past. Folding chairs brought in from administrative buildings arranged in a rough arc behind the scoring station to accommodate larger events. By 0730, the expanded seating was already full, and soldiers were standing in the available space behind the chairs. Sarah had never competed in front of an audience this size. This was not because she lacked experience performing under observation. Her classified training record included evaluation events that were observed by people whose assessments carried consequences far more significant than any competition score. But those events were private. The observation was functional, not theatrical. Here the audience was gathered for a different reason. They wanted to see something happen. They had heard a number 97.4, and they wanted to understand what produced it. She checked her equipment at the staging area without engaging with the audience dynamic. Her equipment had been maintained correctly. Everything was what it should be. She ran through her pre-event protocol, the physical items first, then the mental sequence, and when she was finished, she was ready. At 0745, Hayes arrived at the range. He was in full instructor dress, which was what he wore when he was functioning in an official capacity at a formal assessment. He walked directly to the range director's station and spoke with Major Ford for approximately 4 minutes. Sarah watched this from the staging area without making it obvious that she was watching. The exchange was professional. Neither man's body language suggested conflict, but at one point, Hayes gestured toward the far end of the target array, the position where the fifth target would be configured, and Ford nodded once with the particular nod of a man who was agreeing to something he had some reservation about, but had decided not to contest. Delaney appeared beside her. He adjusted the fifth target, Delaney said quietly. I assumed he would. You know what that means. It means I'll find out when I get to it, she said. Delaney considered this for a moment. You're not worried. It wasn't quite a question. Worry's a tool, she said. It's useful when there's an action it produces. When there's no available action, it's just noise. He looked at her sideways. Did someone teach you that, or did you arrive at it independently? Someone taught it to me, she said. I had to practice it for a long time before it stopped feeling like a thing I was trying to believe and started feeling true. He nodded slowly. How long? Longer than I'd like to admit. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a moment of ease she had experienced since arriving at Fort Raven, and she noted it the way she noted everything. Filed it, let it pass. The assessment was called to order at 0850. Major Ford addressed the participants and observers from the range director's station. He reviewed the format: 5 targets, 1 sequence, no retakes, all participants running simultaneously on their assigned lanes. The scoring system would capture the full data set for each shooter. The results would be announced immediately following the final target. He did not mention the 5th target parameters specifically. Sarah noticed that he did not mention them. She also noticed that Hayes, standing slightly behind and to Ford's left, was watching her when Ford made that omission. Not looking away when she registered it. Just watching. He wanted her to know the 5th target had been adjusted. He wanted her to carry that knowledge into the sequence. He had decided sometime between the briefing last night and this morning that the most productive thing he could do was make the 5th target harder than the standard parameters, harder than what any shooter in the current field had prepared for, and see what happened. It was not a dishonest strategy. It was within his authority. And in a certain light, it was the only remaining test he had available. The preliminary rounds had given her problems she had solved. The alternate parameter run he'd called had given her problems she had solved. The 5th target was the last question he could ask. She understood this. She did not resent it. She respected it in the way she respected any force that arrived with full sincerity. She stepped to the line. The 57 other participants stepped to their lines. The range was quiet in the specific way ranges go quiet when an event with actual stakes is about to begin. Not the polite silence of an audience that has been asked to keep it down, but the organic silence of people whose attention has fully converged on a single point. Ford's voice came over the range intercom. "Sequence initiating in 30 seconds. Sarah exhaled on the count of 6. She looked at the target array. The first target was at 62 meters standard assessment distance, standard movement pattern. She had engaged this geometry more times than she could count. Her body knew it without instruction. Initiating. The first target appeared. She did not rush. Rushing was what the sequence was designed to produce, and giving the sequence what it was designed for was the same as handing the design team the outcome they'd intended. She moved through the engagement with the deliberate speed that was not slow and was not fast, but was exactly the pace that eliminated error without eliminating opportunity. The first target fell. She was already on the second target before the acoustic interference on the first target had finished cycling. The second target moved in the dense overlapping pattern from sequence 3 the previous day, the same pattern or close enough that her muscle memory carried the solution without requiring conscious computation. She adjusted for the real-time variation fired, and the second target dropped. In the observation area, the silence had a texture now. It was not the silence of disengagement. It was the silence of people who were holding something, not breath exactly, but attention at maximum concentration. The third target was harder. The movement pattern included a reversal, an abrupt directional change, built into the target's track, at a point designed to catch a shooter who had committed early to a lead angle. She had seen this before. She waded through the reversal, recalculated, and engaged on the near side of the track after the direction change completed. Third target down. She heard very faintly from the observation area a sound that was not quite speech, but was not silence either. The sound of people who have been holding something and who briefly released it before catching themselves. The fourth target arrived with the dual simultaneous geometry she had solved the previous day. The same counterintuitive engagement order, or close enough that the principle transferred cleanly. She worked the far target first, preserved the window, came back to the near target, engaged. Fourth target down. She did not allow herself to think about the fifth target yet. The fifth target did not exist until the fourth was finished. This was a rule she had learned so early in her training that she couldn't remember the precise moment she'd learned it. It was simply part of her operating framework, the way breathing was part of her operating framework. The fourth target was finished. Now the fifth target existed. It was configured at 98 meters. Standard maximum engagement distance for the ACAA final was 80 meters. She registered this in the half-second before the target appeared. The distance marker on the lane board updated when the target sequence advanced, and she read it with the peripheral awareness she kept for environmental data. 98 meters. Hayes had set the fifth target at 98 meters. This was 18 meters beyond the standard maximum. It was not an impossible engagement distance. It was well within the technical range of the equipment she was using. But it was outside the parameters she had specifically prepared for, and it changed the calculation for windage ballistic drop and timing compensation in ways that were not dramatic but were meaningful. She made the adjustment. Not a dramatic recalibration. A small, precise mental shift that accounted for the additional distance and re-established the framework she needed. The fifth target appeared. It was moving. The pattern was unlike the first four, not a variant of the standard library of movement patterns she had reviewed in preparation. It was something Hayes had designed specifically for this moment, for this sequence, for the question he was trying to answer. She read it. Irregular lateral movement with a variable speed component. The target accelerated and decelerated in a non-rhythmic pattern. The non-rhythmic element was the specific difficulty. A target that moved rhythmically could be timed. A target with variable speed required continuous tracking and real-time adjustment of the lead angle. She tracked it. She did not rush to find the shot. She tracked the movement and let the pattern reveal itself over the first full cycle, approximately 3 seconds, before she began building her engagement solution. Most shooters would feel pressure from the time window and try to engage before the pattern was fully read. She had trained herself out of that instinct. The pattern was irregular, but not random. No pattern generated by a mechanical system was truly random. There was structure in it. She found the structure in the second cycle and understood where the deceleration points were, the moments where the target's speed briefly dropped before the next acceleration. She waited for the deceleration. It came. She fired. The fifth target dropped. The range was completely silent. Not the processing silence. Not the absorbing silence. An absolute silence, the kind that exists in the space between something happening and the full weight of it landing. Major Ford's voice came over the intercom. Assessment complete. Processing final scores. The processing took 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, Sarah stood at the line and maintained her position and did not turn to look at the observation area and did not look for Hayes and did not permit herself to feel anything she hadn't yet earned. The scores were processing. She had done what she came here to do. Whether the scores confirmed it or revealed an error she hadn't caught, was information that would arrive in 40 seconds and not before. She waited. Ford's voice again. Final assessment results. A pause. I'll read the top 3 scores in ascending order. The scores below the top 3 were posted electronically. The top 3 were read aloud. This was the format. Third position, Staff Sergeant Delaney, 94.1. From behind her, she heard Delaney exhale a long, controlled release that was equal parts relief and satisfaction. 94.1 was the best score he had ever posted at a formal assessment. She knew this because he had told her last night at the briefing what his previous best had been. Second position. Ford paused again. The pause was slightly longer than the previous one. Sergeant Major Hayes. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, but the collective attention of the observation area landed on Hayes in a way that had weight to it. Hayes's score was 95.8. This was significant. 95.8 in the final assessment was an exceptional result for any shooter in the field. More than that, it established Hayes as the person to beat. It established him as the person who had in fact committed fully to this assessment, despite everything else that was happening around it. He had not stood back and observed. He had competed. He had posted a score that in any other year would have been the definitive result. First position. The observation area was not breathing. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, 98.6. The silence lasted exactly long enough for the number to travel through the room. Then it broke. Not with applause, this was a military assessment, not a ceremony. But with the sound of people talking to each other, turning to each other, processing what they had just witnessed with whoever was standing nearest to them. The kind of spontaneous sound that a room full of people makes when they have all seen the same remarkable thing, and none of them want to be the first one to just let it sit there in silence. Delaney crossed the distance between their positions and said simply, "Clean 5. Clean 5, she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but had decided that clean 5 was actually sufficient. Hayes walked from his position at the scoring station across the range floor. The observation area watched him do this. He moved with the deliberate purpose of a man who knew that what happened in the next 30 seconds would be observed and interpreted, and who had decided precisely how he wanted it to be observed and interpreted. He stopped in front of Sarah. The two of them stood facing each other with the full attention of every person on that range. Hayes had been doing this for 22 years. He had stood on this range when it was still a raw concrete pad and watched generations of soldiers come through and try to find out what they were made of. He had developed a system for knowing good shooting when he saw it. He had developed a system for knowing good shooters before he saw them shoot. He had built that system from experience, from repetition, from thousands of hours of observation, and it had served him well. It had failed this morning. He had set the fifth target at 98 meters, specifically to expose the limit of something he believed existed. The non-standard movement pattern had been designed to produce exactly the kind of error that a shooter with preparation, but without operational experience, typically produced an early commitment to the lead angle before the full movement pattern was established. She had not made that error, which meant the framework he had built to understand the difference between preparation and experience needed to be revised. 98 meters, he said. Yes, she said. Variable deceleration pattern. Yes. He looked at her with the same careful attention he had brought to the scoring display last night. You waited for the deceleration point. Second cycle, she said. It established clearly enough. He was quiet for a moment. I designed that pattern to reward a shooter who committed early and moved fast. I didn't design it for someone who would wait through a full cycle to find the structure. I know, she said. That's why I waited. Another silence. Who taught you that? She looked at him evenly. You want the name of a person, or you want the honest answer? He considered. Honest answer. I taught myself, she said. After someone showed me what the wrong approach cost. He absorbed this. In the field, he asked. She held his gaze. In conditions that didn't have a reset option. That landed. She watched it land not on his face, which was controlled, but in his posture, the small adjustment in how he was standing. He understood what she meant. He had been in those conditions himself. He knew the exact weight of what it meant to learn something in a situation where the price of the wrong lesson was final. Your record, he said. The classified part. Yes. How much of what I saw today came from that record? She thought about this for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because she wanted to give him the precise answer and not the easy one. All of it, and none of it. What I did today, I could have done this at the beginning of my career if the beginning of my career hadn't shown me exactly what I was doing wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. How long have you been shooting at this level? He asked. Since I stopped trying to shoot faster than I was ready to shoot, she said. He exhaled through his nose a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family as one. The first genuinely human response she had seen from him. Major Ford had approached. He was holding the formal scoring document, the paper record that would accompany the electronic data into the official assessment archive. Sergeant Major, Ford said, the assessment is complete. Results are confirmed. Hayes looked at Ford's document. He looked at the number on it. Then he looked at Sarah. I owe you an apology, he said. She shook her head slightly. You owe me a conversation. The apology can go toward not doing it to the next person. He was quiet for a moment. Fair, he said. The observation area had not dispersed. People were watching this exchange with the full attention of an audience that understood they were seeing something that would be talked about. Not because it was theatrical. Nothing about it was theatrical. But because it was real. And because real things at this scale were not common. One of the junior soldiers in the front row of the seating area leaned toward the soldier beside him, and said quietly enough that he probably thought he was being private about it. Did she just tell Hayes where to put his apology? The soldier beside him said even more quietly. She redirected it. She didn't dismiss it. That's different. Delaney, standing 2 meters to Sarah's left, heard both of them. He caught her eye briefly, and the expression on his face said that he had heard it too and found it accurate. Hayes clasped his hands behind his back, the posture of a man in formal military bearing who had decided to make what he was about to say official rather than personal. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said in a voice that was pitched to carry. "Your performance today across the full assessment represents the most technically complete execution I've seen in this event in 11 years. He paused. The 5th target parameters were set outside standard protocol. That's on record. Your engagement of a non-standard problem under non-standard conditions without prior notice, another pause, is something I will need to rethink how I teach." This was the most public acknowledgement of reconsideration that Victor Hayes had offered in anyone on that range's memory. Several people who had been at Fort Raven long enough to know his history looked at each other, not dramatically. Just the small look that passes between people who have witnessed something they had not expected to see. Sarah nodded once. She did not say thank you because she had not asked for the acknowledgement and did not need it. She did not say anything dismissive because it had been offered sincerely. She let it stand. Then Hayes said something no one on that range expected. "I want to review your training methodology," he said. "Not for myself, for the program, for the next generation of shooters who come through here." And she understood in that moment what he was actually asking. Not for her personal history. Not for access to a classified record he couldn't see. He was asking something harder than that. He was asking whether she was willing to contribute what she knew, the thing that had made her wait through the second cycle, the thing that had made her read the deceleration pattern instead of committing early to the process of making other people better. She looked at him. "I'll need to run that through Colonel Ware," she said. "Understood. But my answer personally is yes." He nodded. Delaney beside her said very quietly, "What just happened?" She picked up her equipment from the staging area and began checking it back in. "Someone decided that being right mattered more than being the person who was always right," she said. "It happens sometimes, not as often as it should." He thought about that. "Does it always look like that when it does?" She considered. "No, usually it looks worse first." He skipped the "looks worse" part. "Is that unusual?" She looked up from her equipment check. For a man with 22 years of established identity as the definitive authority on what excellence looks like. She held his gaze. "Yes, it's unusual. Give him credit for it." Delaney was quiet for a moment. "You're not angry," he said, "at what he did this morning." "I was never angry," she said. "I was focused. There's a difference." "And now?" She finished her equipment check and secured the case. "Now I'm focused on getting to a phone and calling Colonel Ware before Hayes's request comes through official channels, so she hears it from me first." He almost laughed at that, a genuine almost laugh startled out of him. She picked up her case and headed for the staging exit. Behind her, the observation area was still buzzing with the specific energy of an event that had not ended the way most of the people present had expected it to end. Not because the result was surprising precisely, but because the result had been accompanied by something rarer than a high score, a public revision of a long-held position offered willingly by a man who had not been required to offer it. The soldiers in the observation area would talk about the 5 perfect shots for weeks. Some of them would talk about Hayes's acknowledgement for longer. Sarah Mitchell walked to the phone bank at the end of the administrative corridor and dialed Colonel Ware's number. It rang twice. "Mitchell," Colonel Ware said. "The assessment is complete, ma'am." A brief pause. "And I have a request to convey from Sergeant Major Victor Hayes regarding training methodology collaboration." Another pause, slightly longer. "Tell me you're calling me before he does. That's why I'm calling, ma'am." The sound Colonel Ware made was not quite a laugh, but was in the same general vicinity. "What's your score?" she asked. 98.6, Sarah said. Clean 5, including a fifth target Hayes set at 98 meters with a variable deceleration pattern outside standard protocol. Silence on the line. Then Colonel Ware said, "He set the target parameters himself." "Yes, ma'am." "And you still hit it?" "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. This one felt different from the processing silences she had been living in all day. This one felt like the silence of a person who had been waiting for a specific result and who was now integrating the fact of it. "I'll take Hayes's request," Colonel Ware said finally. "Set the conversation for next week." "Yes, ma'am." "Mitchell." "Ma'am." "Well done." Sarah hung up the phone. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she walked back toward the temporary quarters building to collect her materials and begin preparing for the drive back. She had a 2-hour debrief with her unit scheduled for the following morning. She had notes to compile data to organize specific technical observations from the assessment to document while they were still fresh. She had work to do. She always had work to do. That was the thing nobody standing in the observation area fully understood yet, and the thing that was in a specific way the most important part of the entire day. The 98.6 was the result. The clean 5 was the result. The conversation with Hayes was a result. But none of those results were the story. The story was the work that produced them. The hours nobody counted. The repetitions nobody watched. The adjustments made in isolation in training environments where the only observer was the data, and the data didn't care what you expected, it only showed you what was true. She had learned more from her failures in that process than from any of her successes. She had learned more from the moments when the pattern didn't reveal itself in the second cycle, when she had committed early and paid for it, than from any of the clean engagements. And she had learned, most fundamentally, that the difference between what Victor Hayes thought he had seen this morning and what he had actually seen this morning was not talent. It was work. It was the specific, unglamorous, unwitnessed accumulation of work. And that was something anyone could do. That was the only thing in the end that she would ever claim credit for, not the results, but the willingness to do the work that results came from. She pushed open the door to the temporary quarters building and walked down the corridor toward her room. Behind her on the range, Victor Hayes was standing at the scoring display one final time. He was looking at 98.6. He had been in this business long enough to know what it meant. He had also been in it long enough to know what it cost. And for the first time in a long time, he was not certain those two things were the same. Colonel Denise Ware had a rule about phone calls that came in before 800. She answered all of them. Not because she enjoyed early calls, she didn't particularly, but because in her experience, the calls that arrived before the workday officially began tended to be the ones that mattered. The ones that could wait until business hours usually did. The ones that couldn't were the ones that defined what kind of officer you actually were when the situation stopped being theoretical. She had answered Sarah's call at 07:14 on the morning of the final assessment results. By 07:30, she had already pulled what she was authorized to pull from the official assessment reporting system and cross-referenced it against the preliminary data Ford had transmitted to participating unit commanders the previous evening. By 07:45, she had a complete picture of what had happened at Fort Raven, not the personal texture of it which Sarah's call had given her, but the official record. The scores. The alternate parameter run Hayes had called on sequence 3. The fifth target distance that Hayes had set at 98 meters. She sat with that last detail for a moment longer than she sat with the others. 98 meters. Non-standard movement pattern. Outside assessment protocol. And Sarah Mitchell had engaged it cleanly. Ware had been in this business for 26 years. She had seen exceptional shooters. She had trained exceptional shooters. She had designed the program that produced the shooter who had just posted the highest final assessment score at Fort Raven in over a decade, under conditions that the range director had not approved in advance and that no participant had been briefed on. She felt something that she did not often feel, and which she was careful not to indulge for longer than it deserved. She felt proud in a way that was not about herself at all. Then she picked up her phone and called the post commander at Fort Raven. This was the call that Sarah Mitchell did not know about. Not because Ware was hiding anything she wasn't, but because there were dimensions of what had happened at the ACAA that extended beyond one day's scoring results. And Colonel Ware had been managing those dimensions quietly for the entire 18 months that Sarah had been in her program. The post commander at Fort Raven was Brigadier General Michael Thorne. He and Ware had served together twice in two different contexts, and they had the kind of professional relationship that was built on shared experience rather than social cultivation. They respected each other because they had seen each other work. "Denise," Thorne said when he picked up. "Michael, tell me what you saw." A brief pause. "In person or on the scores?" "Both." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a person who is deciding where to begin. "The scores speak for themselves. 98-6, clean 5 including Hayes's fifth target, which I've already had a conversation with Ford about." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I asked why a non-protocol parameter was added to a formal assessment, and Ford explained that it fell within range director discretion and Hayes had invoked it. And I told Ford that range director discretion exists for operational reasons and not for personal hypothesis testing." Ware processed this. What was Ford's response? He agreed. He also said, and I'm quoting him directly, that the unauthorized adjustment may have been the best thing that happened to the assessment because Mitchell's handling of a problem she couldn't have prepared for is the most significant data point in the entire event. Ware had been thinking the same thing. "What did you see in person?" Thorne was quiet for a moment longer this time. "I saw a room full of people recalibrate their understanding of what they were watching in real time," he said. "I've been in this building for 3 years. I've watched the ACAA 11 times. I have never seen an observation area go that quiet. The fifth target, he confirmed, but also, Denise, the sequence before it, the way she worked the fourth target in the dual simultaneous geometry. The alternate sequence 3 that Hayes ran. Every single element. It wasn't one moment. It was a sustained demonstration that built through the day, and the fifth target was just the point where everyone in the room was already fully committed to paying attention. A beat. Hayes set the hardest problem he could construct, and she solved it while 60 people watched. Ware let that sit. "What did Hayes say afterward?" she asked. Thorne made a brief exhale that carried a specific quality. He offered a public acknowledgement that I have been told by 3 separate people who were present is the most significant thing he has said publicly in 5 years. "Sarah told me he apologized. She redirected the apology," Thorne said. "She told him the apology should go toward not doing it to the next person." A pause. "Michael Thorne, I want to be clear that this is a direct quote. He said that to me. And I want you to know that your officer said that to a sergeant major with 22 years in front of 60 witnesses, and not one person on that range had a problem with it." Ware was quiet. "He also requested a training methodology consultation," she said. "I know. He called me last night." Thorne paused again. "He called me at 2200 Denise. Victor Hayes called me at 2200 to tell me that the methodology behind Mitchell's training approach was something he wanted to incorporate into the standing instructor curriculum." This was the detail that landed heaviest. Hayes had not waited. He had not slept on it, not processed it over a week, and arrived gradually at the conclusion that the thing he had witnessed deserved a formal response. He had called the post commander at 10 o'clock at night because he did not want to wait until morning to put his response on the record. That was information about the depth of what he had seen. "I'll set the consultation for next week," Ware said, "through official channels. I'll facilitate on this end." Thorne paused one more time, and the quality of this pause was different from the others. It had the weight of something he had been deciding whether to say. "Denise, I want to bring Mitchell in for a debrief with my staff, not about the assessment results, about the training approach, what she built, how she built it, what the decision-making framework looks like from the inside." He paused again. "I want my instructors to hear it from her directly. She's in my program for another 6 months," Ware said. "I know, I'm not asking to pull her. I'm asking for 2 days. Ware thought about this. She thought about Sarah Mitchell, who was probably in the temporary quarters building right now, collecting her materials and compiling her notes and preparing for a 2-hour drive back with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything. She thought about the 98.6. She thought about Victor Hayes calling at 2200. I'll ask her, Ware said. If she's willing, you'll have 2 days. That's all I'm asking. She hung up. She sat with the information for approximately 90 seconds. Then she made a second call, this one to her program's administrative coordinator, and asked for Sarah Mitchell's return schedule to be adjusted. Not significantly. 2 additional days before the debrief. 2 days that would be needed for the conversation that was now scheduled to happen with General Thorne's staff. Then she picked up her pen and began drafting the official response to Hayes's consultation request. She wrote it carefully. She had learned a long time ago that the moments when institutions changed really changed at the level of how they understood excellence and what they were willing to learn from it were fragile. They required the right conditions and the right handling and, crucially, the right amount of time. Too fast, and the institution reverted to its prior frameworks because the change hadn't been integrated. Too slow, and the moment passed and the prior frameworks hardened around whatever small adjustments had been made and called it complete. Hayes's call at 2200 was a window. It needed to be handled correctly. She was going to handle it correctly. While Colonel Ware was writing at Fort Bragg, Sarah Mitchell was 300 miles north in the temporary quarters at Fort Raven, and she was not sleeping and not reviewing data and not preparing for the drive home. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her scoring data in her lap, and she was thinking about a conversation that had happened 2 years ago in a training facility. She was not permitted to name in a session that did not appear in any unclassified record, with a woman named Captain Reyes, who was the best shooter Sarah had ever personally observed, and who was also, at the time, in the process of leaving the program. Reyes had been in the program for 4 years. She had posted exceptional results in every evaluation. She had the classified record that everyone in that facility was building and that nobody outside it could see. And she had decided at the end of her 4th year that she was leaving not the military, but the program, and going to a conventional unit. Sarah had asked her why. Reyes had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "Because the program is not the point. The program is where you build the thing. But the thing, what you actually become in here, it only means something if you take it somewhere it can be seen." Sarah had not fully understood that at the time. She had filed it. She had let it process. She understood it now. The 5th target at 98 meters had not been a test of her marksmanship. Hayes thought it was. Hayes had designed it to be. But what it had actually been, what it had functioned as in the total context of the day, was an occasion for the thing she had built in private and in classified environments, and in the accumulated weight of years nobody had witnessed to be visible. Reyes had been right. You had to take it somewhere it could be seen. She put the scoring data aside and lay back on the bed. She did not sleep, but she stopped moving through the information and let it rest. At 0900 the following morning she was supposed to be on the road. At 0840 there was a knock on her door. She opened it. Victor Hayes was standing in the corridor. He was in civilian clothes, a gray shirt, dark pants, which was the first time she had seen him in anything other than full instructor dress. He looked different without it. Not smaller exactly. More specific. More like a person and less like a position. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She looked at it. "It's not a gesture," he said. "It's coffee. The dining facility makes it 2 weeks, so I bring my own. I made enough for 2. She took the cup. He did not ask to come in. She stepped back, and he understood this as the invitation it was, and he came in and sat in the single chair beside the small desk, and she sat on the bed, and they were 2 people in a small room with 2 cups of coffee and a day's worth of unfinished conversation between them. "You're leaving at 0900, he said. "Yes, I won't take long." He held his cup with both hands, a gesture that had nothing military about it, just a person holding something warm. I've been doing this for 22 years. In 22 years, I have adjusted training parameters 3 times outside standard protocol. Each time I believed the situation warranted it. Each time I was right about the situation warranting it. He paused. Yesterday was the 4th time. And, she said, and I was wrong about the purpose. He looked at her directly. I thought I was testing whether you could handle the unexpected. I was actually confirming something I didn't want to be confirmed. She was quiet, waiting. I wanted you to fail, he said. It came out flat and direct, the way a person says something when they've decided the only option left is accuracy. Not because of anything specific. Because you made me uncomfortable, and comfort is something I've protected for a long time without admitting I was protecting it. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Because you redirected my apology, he said, and you were right to. An apology keeps the focus on the person apologizing. What I actually owe you is an honest account of what happened and what I'm taking from it. He paused. So that's what I'm giving you. She processed this. The consultation request, she said. For the training methodology. I meant it. I know. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, what do you think you'll find when you look at the methodology? He thought about this for a moment. Real thought she could see it happening. I think I'll find that the difference between what you did yesterday and what my best shooters do is not a technical difference, he said slowly. I think it's a decision-making architecture. The way you construct the problem before you engage it. The waiting through the second cycle, that's not patience. That's a trained cognitive process. He looked at her. Am I close? You're close, she said. What am I missing? She thought about how to say it accurately. You're describing it from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a decision-making architecture. From the inside, it feels like trust. She paused, looking for the right words. At some point, you have to trust that the work you've done is sufficient. And trusting that is harder than doing the work for most people. Because the work is concrete. You can count it, measure it, compare it to a standard. The trust is, it's not measurable. You either have it, or you're performing it, and performing it costs you something in the moment. He was very still. And you have it, he said. I built it, she said. After a long time of performing it, there's a difference. He sat with that. Who taught you the distinction? The situations that showed me what performing it felt like when it failed, she said. He nodded slowly. Not the quick nod of a person who is moving past information they've processed, the slow nod of a person who is actually receiving something. The 5th target, he said. At 98 meters with the variable deceleration, you waited through 2 full cycles. Yes. Most shooters in that position, even very good ones, would have felt the time window and committed at 1 cycle. Yes. What made you wait? She looked at him. Because 1 cycle wasn't enough to know, she said simply, and not knowing was worse than the risk of the window closing. He was quiet for a long moment. That's the thing I need to teach, he said, not to her, to himself, or to the room. That's the thing I don't know how to teach yet. You can't teach it directly, she said. You can only create conditions where people are forced to discover it for themselves. He looked at her sharply. What kind of conditions? High stakes with a real time window and no reset, she said. The situations that make you commit before you're ready and then show you immediately what that cost. Not simulated consequence, actual consequence. The kind where you have to account for the error to someone other than yourself. Something moved across his face. The classified program. Among other things, she said. He sat back in the chair, the posture of a man who is reorganizing something fundamental. I've been running this program for 11 years, he said. I've watched 17 shooters post perfect scores. I built the conditions they trained under. A pause. And I don't know if I've ever created conditions that taught what you just described. Probably not, she said, not unkindly. Because the conditions that teach it aren't comfortable to design. They require the designer to accept that some people in the program will fail in ways that aren't clean. Ways that don't produce a correctable score. They produce a lesson that's only useful if the person can receive it. He looked at her with an expression that was more complicated than anything she had seen from him across the 2 days they'd been at the same installation. You failed, he said. In the program, before you arrived at what you have now. It wasn't really a question. Several times, she said. In specific ways I still think about. What did you do with that? She picked up her coffee and looked at it for a moment. I chose to understand it as data, she said. Not as a verdict. The failure told me exactly where my framework was wrong. If I'd never failed, I wouldn't have known where the wrongness was. He was quiet for a moment. That's not how I've been running this program, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. The silence that followed was the comfortable kind, the kind that means two people have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and are simply letting it settle. Hayes finished his coffee. He set the cup down on the desk. The consultation next week, he said. I want to bring Ford and 2 of my senior instructors. Colonel Ware will determine who's in the room, she said. Of course. He stood up. But if she gives you input on the guest list, Ford and the 2 instructors. One of them is the youngest, 28. She posted the highest preliminary score in her cohort last year, and then missed the clean 5 in the final by a single critical error. He paused. She needs to hear what you just told me. Sarah looked at him. She committed early, Sarah said. On the 5th target, Hayes confirmed. And she has been carrying that as a failure for 14 months. Something shifted in the room. Tell her it was data, Sarah said. Tell her what it showed her about her framework, and ask her whether she's used it. I will, Hayes said. After next week. He picked up his empty cup and moved toward the door. He stopped. Mitchell, he said without turning. Yes, yesterday morning, when I made that comment in front of the range. A pause. The whole range heard it. Yes, she said. And you didn't respond. No. He turned just enough to look at her over his shoulder. Why not? You had grounds. You had every right. She thought about it for a moment. Because responding would have made it about you and me, she said. And what I came here to do had nothing to do with you and me. He absorbed this. The range heard me ask you to prove it, he said. Yes. And you walked to the line and did exactly that. That's all I know how to do, she said. He nodded once. Good answer, he said, and walked out. She sat with the empty room for a moment after the door closed. Then she picked up her bag and her scoring data and her gear and began the process of checking out of the temporary quarters. At the front desk, the administrative specialist on duty, a young corporal who couldn't have been more than 20, with the particular alertness of someone who had been told something interesting was happening at this installation and had been paying attention to find out what processed her checkout paperwork without comment, and then, as she was turning to leave, said Lieutenant. She stopped. I was in the observation area yesterday, the corporal said, not elaborating, not asking a question, just placing that information in the space between them. Okay, Sarah said. The 5th target. The corporal paused. When the distance marker updated and everyone saw 98 meters, I was watching your shoulders. Sarah looked at her. They didn't move, the corporal said. No, Sarah said. They didn't. The corporal looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding whether the question they want to ask is the right question to ask. How do you do that? The corporal asked. Sarah thought about Hayes 40 minutes ago in her room. She thought about the answer she'd given him. She thought about what the right version of that answer was for a 20-year-old corporal standing at an administrative desk at 0850 in the morning. You decide in advance, Sarah said. Not about the outcome, about whether you've done the work. If you've done the work, the number on the distance marker is just information. It's not a threat. She paused. If you haven't done the work, then it's a threat, and your shoulders will tell everyone. The corporal was very still. How do you know if you've done enough work? She asked. You don't, Sarah said. That's the part nobody tells you. You never know in advance. You only know after. So at some point you have to decide to trust the work you've done instead of the certainty you're looking for. She picked up her bag. And the way you build that trust is by doing the work one more time. And then again. Until the repetitions are so deep that trusting them feels less scary than not trusting them. The corporal looked at her. Is that what it felt like yesterday? Yesterday, Sarah said, it felt like a target at 98 meters with a variable deceleration pattern. Nothing more. She walked out. The drive back was 300 miles and she made it in 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was the time it took when traffic was clean, and she drove at exactly the speed limit the entire way, because she had never once been cited for a moving violation, and she was not going to start on the day after an ACAA final. She thought for portions of the drive about the corporal, about the question the corporal had asked, how do you do that? And about the fact that it was the same question Hayes had been asking underneath every technical question he'd posed. How do you do that? How do you stand at a line with 60 people watching and a 9/8 meter target configured by someone who wanted you to fail and still keep your shoulders still? The answer she had given Hayes was the correct answer. The answer she had given the corporal was also correct for the corporal's level. But underneath both of them was a simpler answer, the one that was so fundamental she almost never said it directly, because when you said it directly, it sounded too plain to carry the weight it was actually carrying. The simpler answer was, you stop making it about yourself. The moment on the firing line stops being threatening. The moment it stops being about whether you will succeed or fail in front of witnesses. The moment it becomes purely about the problem, the target, the distance, the movement pattern, the physics of it, the witnesses stop existing in any relevant sense. They're just atmosphere. They're what's in the background when you're doing the thing you came to do. She had learned this not in the classified program, and not under Colonel Ware, and not from any instructor whose name she could cite in an official document. She had learned it the first time she had failed publicly, in front of witnesses who mattered to her, in a situation where the cost of the failure was real, and the witnesses carried their own expectations of her, and she had missed the shot because she was thinking about herself and not about the target. And afterward, in the particular silence that follows, of failure that is witnessed and that cannot be unwitnessed, she had understood what had happened. She had made herself the subject of the problem instead of the target. She never made that mistake again. Not because she was extraordinary, because she understood what the mistake cost, and the cost was too high. She arrived back at the base at 1340. She checked in, secured her vehicle, and walked to her quarters. She had 14 messages, waiting the administrative account that processed routine unit communications. She read them in order, flagging the ones that required responses and archiving the ones that were informational. The last message in the queue was from an address she didn't immediately recognize. She opened it. It was from Sergeant Major Victor Hayes, sent at 11:02 while she was still on the road. The message was short. It said, I told the junior instructor what you said about the fifth target error being data and not a verdict. She cried. I thought you should know that it landed. Sarah read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Then she typed a short reply. Tell her to use it. That's the only way data becomes something. She sent it and closed the account. She pulled out her scoring data and her notebook and sat down at her desk. She had 2 hours before the scheduled check-in with Colonel Ware's administrative staff. She had notes to compile observations to document specific technical elements from the assessment to write up in the format her program used for after-action data. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the first clean page. Then she wrote, because this was how she began every after-action documentation, the core question the event had tested. What did you know going in? And what do you know now that you didn't know then? She thought about it carefully. What she knew, going in the technical parameters of the ACAA, her own preparation level, the general profile of the field she was competing in, and the fact that Hayes had influence over the fifth target configuration. What she knew now, that 98 meters with a variable deceleration pattern was solvable if you waited. That Hayes's framework was genuinely open to revision when the evidence was sufficient. That a corporal at an administrative desk in a temporary quarters building was thinking about exactly the same fundamental question as a sergeant major with 22 years in, they were just asking it from different distances, and that the space between those two people, the corporal and Hayes, was not as large as it appeared from the outside. She wrote that down. She wrote it carefully because the careful writing was part of the processing, and the processing was part of the work, and the work was the only thing that had ever gotten her anywhere. Then she put her pen down and looked at the wall for exactly 60 seconds, which was the amount of time she permitted herself between the completion of one significant event and the beginning of preparation for the next one. The 60 seconds ended. She picked up her pen, and she kept going. The debrief with Colonel Ware's staff happened at 0800 the following morning, and it ran 2 hours and 40 minutes longer than scheduled. This was not unusual for after-action reviews in Ware's program. The standard format was 2 hours enough time to move through the technical data, the scoring analysis, the situational observations, and any anomalies worth flagging. But Ware's debriefs had a tendency to extend when the material warranted it, and Ware had a specific way of knowing when material warranted it. She watched her staff. When they stopped taking notes and started leaning forward, she let the conversation go where it needed to go. By the 40-minute mark, 3 of the 5 staff members present had stopped taking notes. Sarah had arrived with her documentation compiled exactly as the program format required. Organized complete flagged by category, with the anomalies section running significantly longer than it normally did. The anomalies section documented the alternate sequence 3. Hayes had called the fifth target parameters, and the sequence of post-assessment conversations in the order they had occurred. She had written all of it with the same flat precision she applied to technical data, because her program had trained her to understand that the interpersonal material was as analytically significant as the ballistic material. You couldn't separate them. The context in which performance happened was part of the data about the performance. Ware read the anomalies section first. She read it without comment, which was how she read everything she intended to take seriously. When she was done, she set the document on the table and looked at Sarah. "Walk me through the fifth target," she said. "Not the mechanics, the decision architecture." Sarah walked her through it. The distance marker updating, the non-standard movement pattern, the choice to track through 2 full cycles before engaging. She used the same language she had used with Hayes in the small room at the temporary quarters, because it was accurate language, and she saw no reason to change accurate language for a different audience. When she finished, Major Trent Ware's senior training officer, a quiet man with 15 years in, who Sarah had always found to be the sharpest analytical mind in the room, said, "You made that decision in real time, with the time window running." "Yes," Sarah said. "How long did the first cycle take?" "Approximately 3 seconds. So you committed to a 3-second wait with an active time window and a non-standard movement pattern you had never encountered before?" "Yes." "What was your read on the window length?" "I estimated 18 to 22 seconds of viable engagement opportunity based on the target's general speed range in the first cycle. That gave me the second cycle to work with and still leave sufficient time." Trent wrote something down. "And if the second cycle had revealed a pattern that wasn't engageable in your remaining window?" "Then I would have accepted the miss," Sarah said. Trent looked up from his notes. Ware said nothing, but something in her posture shifted the small shift of a person who has just heard the specific thing they were waiting to hear. "Explain that," Trent said. "Accepting a miss was the correct outcome if the pattern wasn't readable," Sarah said. "An unreadable pattern means insufficient data. Engaging on insufficient data in that specific geometry would have cost me the shot and potentially compromised my position for the scoring calculation." She paused. A clean miss is a recoverable score. A bad shot with a compromised position is a different kind of error. Trent leaned back in his chair. You were willing to miss, he said. I was willing to make the correct decision regardless of whether the outcome was a hit, Sarah said. Those are different things, but they produced the same behavior in the moment. The room was quiet. Ware looked at her staff, one of them Captain Reyes. Sarah stopped. The woman sitting at the far end of the table on Ware's staff was Captain Adriana Reyes. The same Captain Reyes who had sat across from Sarah 2 years ago in a training facility she couldn't name, and said the program is where you build the thing, but the thing only means something. If you take it somewhere, it can be seen. Reyes was watching Sarah with an expression that was entirely neutral, in the controlled way of someone who has pre-decided to be neutral and is executing that decision precisely. Sarah had not known Reyes was on Ware's staff. Reyes had left the program. She had said she was going to a conventional unit. At some point in the intervening 2 years, conventional had led somewhere else, and somewhere else had led here. Their eye contact lasted exactly as long as professional acknowledgement required. Reyes nodded once. Sarah nodded once. Ware, who missed nothing, let it pass without comment. The debrief continued through the technical sections, the scoring analysis, the interaction sequence with Hayes. When Sarah reached the post-assessment conversation, Hayes in her room with 2 cups of coffee, Trent asked her to slow down and repeat the exchange almost verbatim, which she could do because she had documented it the same day, and her memory for precise language in significant conversations was one of the things the program had deliberately trained. When she recounted Hayes's statement, "I wanted you to fail, not because of anything specific, because you made me uncomfortable," the room went very quiet. He said that, Trent said, confirming, not questioning. Those were his words, Sarah said. Trent looked at Ware. Ware said, continue. Sarah continued through the exchange. The part about trust versus performing trust. The part about failure as data. The part about the junior instructor who had been carrying a critical error for 14 months. When she finished, the room was quiet again, and this time Ware let the quiet run for a moment before she spoke. The consultation request from Hayes, Ware said. You told him you'd need to run it through me. Yes, ma'am. And personally, your answer was yes. Yes, ma'am. Ware looked at the table for a moment. Reyes, she said. Reyes said, ma'am. You've reviewed the assessment data. Yes, ma'am. Your read on the consultation request. Reyes was quiet for a moment. It's legitimate, she said. Hayes is asking for something real. He's not asking for access to the program, he's asking to understand the framework that produces the outcome he witnessed. Those are different asks, and the second one is answerable without compromising anything classified. She paused. I think the consultation is worth having. I think the more interesting question is who else should be in the room besides Hayes's team. Ware looked at her. Who are you thinking? General Thorne requested 2 days with Mitchell for his staff, Reyes said. I think the consultation and the Thorne debrief should happen sequentially, not separately. Same core material, 2 different audiences within the same week. The institutional value multiplies if the information moves in parallel rather than in series. Trent was nodding. And the junior instructor Hayes mentioned the one who made the error 14 months ago. She should be in both rooms. Sarah looked at Trent. Why? She asked. Because she's the person in that system who is closest to understanding what you're describing, he said. Hayes is rebuilding a framework from the outside in. She's rebuilding from the inside out. The conversation between those 2 processes is the most valuable thing that can happen in that room. Sarah thought about this. What's her name? Sarah asked. Ware said Lieutenant Carla Voss. Sarah filed it. The debrief wrapped at 11:17. Ware kept Sarah after the others had cleared. They sat on opposite sides of the table with the documentation between them, and Ware looked at Sarah the way she had looked at her when she'd first arrived in the program 18 months ago, with the full careful attention of a person who was taking an accurate measure. "You're not the same person who walked into this program," Ware said. "No, ma'am," Sarah said. "What's the difference?" Sarah thought about it. "I trust the work now. I didn't at the beginning. I was performing the trust, and it was costing me in the moments it mattered most." Ware was quiet for a moment. "When did it shift?" "Slowly," Sarah said. "And then, all at once, the way most things shift." Ware almost smiled. It was not an expression she deployed often, which meant it carried weight when it appeared. "The consultation is approved," Ware said. "Trent will coordinate the logistics with Hayes's office and General Thorne's staff. You'll have prep time the day before." She paused. "I want you to think carefully about what you say to Lieutenant Voss specifically." "The junior instructor," Sarah said. "She's 28, Ware said. "She's been in the shadow of that critical error for over a year. She's talented, genuinely talented, and she has been shrinking because of something that should have made her larger." Sarah understood what Ware was asking her to do, and it was harder than hitting 5 targets at any distance. It was harder because it required her to take something that had been entirely private, the interior architecture of how she had rebuilt herself after failure, and make it legible to someone who needed it, without having the context that made it meaningful to Sarah herself. "I'll think about it," Sarah said. "That's all I'm asking," Ware said. Sarah gathered her materials and stood. "Mitchell," Ware said. She stopped. "Hayes called Thorne at 2200, Ware said. "The night of the assessment, you know that." "You told me, yes ma'am." "He's been in this business for 22 years, and he called his post commander at 10 o'clock at night to put his response on record." Ware looked at her. "You understand what that means?" "It means what he saw was significant enough that he didn't want to wait," Sarah said. "It means you changed something," Ware said. "Not in him specifically, in the system he represents. Systems change when the people inside them encounter something they cannot accommodate with their existing framework, and they choose to rebuild the framework instead of dismissing the thing they can't accommodate." She paused. "Most people dismiss the thing. Hayes didn't." Sarah held her gaze. "He gets credit for that," Sarah said. "He does," Ware agreed. "And you get credit for being the thing he couldn't dismiss." Sarah walked out into the corridor. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked to the training floor and ran her afternoon sequence because the consultation was 4 days away, and she had not stopped working because a debrief had gone well, and she was not going to start. The 4 days before the consultation passed with the specific density of days that are carrying more weight than they appear to. She trained in the mornings. She worked on her documentation in the afternoons. She spent the evenings thinking about Lieutenant Carla Voss, about how to reach someone who had been shrinking under the weight of a single error for 14 months, without making her feel studied, without making the conversation clinical, without turning her own experience into a lesson that landed from above instead of arriving from the side. The night before the consultation, Reyes knocked on her door. Sarah opened it. Reyes was in off-duty clothes and holding nothing. She came in and sat in the chair beside the desk, with the ease of someone who had sat in many chairs, in many small rooms. "Tomorrow," Reyes said. "Tomorrow." Sarah agreed. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about Voss?" "Yes." "What are you planning to say to her?" "I don't know yet," Sarah said. "I'm trying to find the right entry point." Reyes looked at the wall. "When I left the program, when I told you that the thing only means something, if you take it somewhere it can be seen, do you know what I was thinking about?" "No," Sarah said. "I was thinking about the first time I failed in a situation with real consequences," Reyes said. "Not in training, in an actual operational context where the failure had a cost beyond my score." She paused. "I carried it for about a year. I called it data. I told myself it was useful information. And all of that was true, but underneath the true things, I was also ashamed. And the shame was doing something the data couldn't fix." Sarah watched her. "What fixed it?" Sarah asked. "Someone told me the shame was normal," Reyes said. "Not helpful, normal. And that normal things didn't require fixing, they required moving through." She looked at Sarah. "That's your entry point with Voss. Not the data, not the framework, not the decision architecture. She paused. Tell her the shame is normal. Tell her it doesn't mean the error was bigger than she is. Sarah was quiet. Did someone tell you that? She asked. Eventually, Reyes said. Too late to save the 14 months I spent shrinking. She stood up. Don't let her spend 14 months. She walked out. Sarah sat with the empty room. She thought about the second cycle, about wading through it, about the 3 seconds of tracking that felt in real time like a decision about trust. Trust that the pattern would reveal itself. Trust that the work was sufficient. Trust that not knowing yet was a survivable condition. She thought about Voss hitting a non-threat target 14 months ago and carrying it since. She thought about how data was only as useful as the framework you received it in. The consultation convened at 0900 in a conference room at Fort Raven that had been prepared for a meeting of 14 people. Hayes was there with Major Ford and 2 senior instructors. General Thorne was there with 3 staff members. Ware was there with Trent and Reyes. Sarah was at the end of the table. Lieutenant Carla Voss was seated midway along the left side between one of Hayes's senior instructors and one of Thorne's staff members. She was 28 years old, and she had the particular posture of someone who has been told they are valued and who does not quite believe it. She had dark eyes that moved carefully around the room without settling, and when her gaze reached Sarah, it stopped for a moment with the specific quality of recognition. She knew who Sarah was. She knew why Sarah was in the room, and she was not certain how she felt about it. Sarah noted all of this, filed it. Hayes opened the session. He did it formally because Hayes was a formal man, and because making it formal was his way of communicating that what was happening in this room was serious and worth the structure. He summarized the ACAA assessment in objective terms, the scores, the parameter adjustments, the final results. He did not editorialize. He stated facts in the order they had occurred. When he finished the factual summary, he said, I asked for this consultation because the assessment at Fort Raven last week produced a result I could not fully account for using my existing training framework. Lieutenant Mitchell's performance, specifically her engagement of the 5th target under non-standard parameters, represented a decision-making approach that I have not seen articulated in any curriculum I am familiar with. He looked at Sarah. I'm asking Lieutenant Mitchell to walk us through that approach in whatever terms she finds most accurate. The room looked at her. Sarah had prepared remarks. She had a structure technical first, then the decision framework, then the application principles. Organized logical building from what the room already understood toward what they hadn't encountered yet. She set the prepared remarks aside. I want to start somewhere different from where I plan to start, she said. Hayes looked at her with a slight shift of attention that meant he was paying a different kind of attention now. I want to start with failure, she said. Specifically with what failure is and what it isn't. Because I think the framework I use for performance is only understandable if you understand how I think about the errors I've made. She looked around the table. And I want to direct that part of the conversation at Lieutenant Voss if she's willing. The room was very still. Voss looked at her. Something in her face went carefully neutral, the same careful neutrality Reyes had used in the debrief room. But underneath it, something was already changing, because Sarah had said her name directly, and she hadn't expected that. I'm willing, Voss said. Sarah looked at her. 14 months ago. Sarah said you made a critical error on the 5th target in the ACAA final. You engaged a non-threat target. It cost you the clean score. Voss held very still. Yes, she said. Tell me what you've been calling that error since it happened. A pause. The room was not breathing. A failure of target discrimination, Voss said. Her voice was even, controlled. What else have you been calling it? Sarah said. Longer pause. A mistake I should have been better trained to avoid, Voss said. What else? The room was completely silent. Voss looked at Sarah with an expression that was starting to crack at the edges, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Sarah was looking for it. Evidence that I'm not as ready as I thought I was, Voss said. Her voice stayed level. Barely. Sarah nodded. Here's what I want to tell you, Sarah said. Not what the error means technically. What it means as a fact about you. She paused. It means you were moving too fast to read the indicator clearly. That's a decision architecture problem. It's specific. It's correctable. It tells you exactly one thing about your framework: you were prioritizing speed over certainty at the moment when the decision required certainty over speed. Another pause. It does not mean you're not ready. It does not mean you're less capable than your score suggested. It means you learned something in the worst possible way with an audience and a permanent record, and that lesson is now available to you if you choose to receive it as information instead of verdict. Tien. The room had not moved. Voss was looking at her. The careful neutrality had shifted into something harder to name, not relief, not gratitude, but the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight that someone else has just named accurately for the first time. And the shame, Sarah said, that you've been feeling underneath the data and the technical analysis, the part you haven't been telling people about because it doesn't fit the professional framework. Voss didn't move. That's normal, Sarah said. It doesn't need fixing. It needs moving through. You're allowed to have it. You are not allowed to let it be the reason you commit early on the next fifth target to prove to yourself that you've fixed something that was never broken in the first place. Voss exhaled. One breath. Controlled, but real. Hayes at the head of the table was watching Voss. He had the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he had been trying to accomplish by other means for 14 months and had not been able to, and who was now understanding exactly why he couldn't. Thorne was writing something. Trent's pen had stopped moving. Reyes at the far end of the table was looking at the surface in front of her with the expression of someone who is listening very carefully and whose face has gone deliberately still because the material is hitting something personal. Sarah looked around the table. Everything I'm going to tell you today about decision-making architecture and performance frameworks under pressure, she said, is built on top of what I just told Lieutenant Voss. If you understand that foundation, that failure is specific correctable data that lives in a professional framework but also lands in a personal one, and that both need to be addressed, then what follows makes sense. If you skip that foundation, you'll have a technical framework with no structure underneath it, and it will work until the first high-stakes moment, and then it will crack. She looked at Hayes. He nodded. She began. She talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Not without interruption. There were questions, clarifications, moments where Trent or Ford pressed on specific technical points, and she worked through the detail with them. But she held the thread. She moved from the foundation she'd laid with Voss, through the decision architecture she'd described to Hayes in her room, through the specific cognitive processes she used in the fifth target engagement, through the training conditions in Ware's program that had built those processes, through the principles underlying those conditions, and why they produced results that standard training didn't. At the 90-minute mark, she said, the variable deceleration pattern Hayes designed for the fifth target, the one I hadn't encountered before. When I tell you I waited through 2 full cycles to read it, I want to be clear about what waiting felt like from the inside. She paused. It felt like fear. Not of the target. Fear of the window closing. Fear that I had misjudged the available time. Every trained instinct I had was telling me to commit because committing is faster and faster felt safer. She looked at the room. The thing I had to override was not the instinct to commit early. That's not possible. The instinct is there. It's biological. You cannot remove it. What I had to do was trust the work more than I trusted the instinct. And that is not a natural feeling. It is an acquired skill. And you acquire it by making the wrong choice, first paying the price, and then building the alternative so thoroughly that it becomes available when the instinct fires. Hayes said, how many times did you make the wrong choice before the alternative was available? She looked at him. More times than I have documented, she said, and in situations where the cost was higher than a scored event. The room absorbed this. Voss said, "In the field." "Yes," Sarah said. Voss was quiet for a moment. "And you came back from that." "I came back from it with better information than I went in with," Sarah said. "Whether that's the same as coming back depends on what you mean by coming back." Voss looked at her for a long time. "It's enough," Voss said. Quietly, like someone saying something they'd been working toward for a while. "Yes," Sarah said. "It is." Hayes closed the formal session at 11:40. The room began to move, people gathering materials, conversations, breaking into pairs and small groups, the natural dispersion of a meeting that has produced more material than can be processed in the room. Voss crossed to Sarah's end of the table. She stood there for a moment without saying anything, in the way of someone who has several things available to say and is deciding which one is true enough to use. "The non-threat indicator," Voss said. "The one I missed. I've been going over it for 14 months. The angle was bad, the indicator was partially obscured, the time window was tight. There were 3 external factors that contributed to the error." "Yes," Sarah said. "I know all 3 of those things. I documented all 3 of them. I've reviewed the documentation probably 40 times. She paused. "It didn't help." "No," Sarah said. "It wouldn't." "Why not?" Sarah looked at her. "Because you were using the external factors to argue against the verdict," she said. "And verdicts don't respond to arguments. They respond to time and new evidence." She paused. "The time has passed. Today was the new evidence." Voss was quiet for a moment. "What was the new evidence?" she asked. "That someone who understood the weight of what you've been carrying could look at it directly and tell you it wasn't a verdict," Sarah said. "That's all it needed to be." Voss nodded. She didn't say thank you. Sarah was glad she didn't. It would have been too small for what was happening. She just nodded and walked toward where Hayes was standing with Ford, and Sarah watched her go and saw the quality of the walk. Something in the shoulders, something in the way the weight was distributed, that was slightly different from the walk she'd had coming into the room. Not transformed, not fixed, just slightly less compressed. That was enough. That was more than enough. Reyes appeared beside her. "You changed the entry point," she said. "You gave me the entry point," Sarah said. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Did it land?" Sarah looked at Voss now in conversation with Hayes, her posture open in a way it hadn't been an hour ago. "Watch her shoulders," Sarah said. Reyes looked. Then she said, "Yeah, it landed." General Thorne stopped beside them before leaving. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, "I have been in meetings about training methodology for 20 years. I have never been in a meeting where the most technically precise material was also the most personally significant material." He paused. "What you built in this room today, that's not a curriculum. That's a foundation. We'll build the curriculum on top of it, but what you gave this room was the foundation." He extended his hand. She shook it. "Thank you, General," she said. He left. Ware came to stand beside her. The room was mostly empty now. The institutional weight of the morning was dispersing into the ordinary afternoon. The way institutional weight always did, not vanishing, but redistributing, moving from the concentrated point of the event into the larger fabric of the people who had been present. "Voss," Ware said. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "You found the entry point." "Reyes found it," Sarah said. "I delivered it." Ware looked at her. "That's also a skill," Ware said. Sarah picked up her materials. Outside in the corridor, she could hear Voss's voice, clear and direct, carrying the specific quality of someone who has just recovered access to a register they had stopped using. She was talking to Ford about the non-threat target geometry. Not defending, not explaining away, analyzing. The voice of a person who had put down a weight they'd been carrying in the wrong way and picked up a tool they knew how to use. Sarah walked out into the afternoon. She had a training session in 40 minutes. She was already thinking about the problem set. 3 months after the consultation at Fort Raven, Sarah Mitchell received a letter. Not an email, not an official communication through the administrative system. A handwritten letter on plain paper, in the careful and slightly cramped handwriting of someone who did not write by hand, often, but had decided that this particular thing needed to be said in a way that required effort. It was from Lieutenant Carla Voss. Sarah read it standing at her desk, still in her training clothes, from the morning session, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. The letter was 2 pages. It described with the specific precision of someone who had been trained to document things accurately what the 3 months since the consultation had looked like from the inside. Voss had gone back to the range. She had run her problem sets differently, not because she had overhauled her technique, but because the internal framework had shifted in the way Sarah had described the shame was no longer sitting on top of the data, filtering what she could receive from her own performance. She was reading her errors as information. She was adjusting and moving forward instead of adjusting and bracing. And then 6 weeks after the consultation, she had run the ACAA simulation sequence at her unit's training facility. The full format, all 5 targets, including the 5th target geometry, that had cost her the clean score 14 months ago. The range director had set it at standard parameters. She had worked through the first 4 targets the way she always had. Then the 5th target had appeared. She had waited. She had tracked through the first cycle, found the structure in the second, engaged on the deceleration point. Clean hit. Voss wrote, "I stood at the line after, and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I expected relief. I expected to feel like something was fixed. But what I actually felt was that the thing that needed to happen had simply happened in the way that things happen when the framework is correct and the work is sufficient. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like what it actually was, a correct decision executed correctly, producing a correct outcome. I thought you should know what that felt like, because I think you already know, and I think you've known for a long time that this is what it feels like when it's real." She had signed it with her name and her rank and a single additional line at the bottom. "Thank you for not making it smaller than it was." Sarah read the letter twice. She set it on the desk beside the cold coffee. She stood there for a moment with the specific internal stillness that arrives when something completes, not a dramatic completion, not a resolution with music underneath it, but the quiet completion of a circle that began with a problem and ended with its solution, moving forward in someone else's hands. Then she picked up her training bag and went back to the range because she had an afternoon session in 20 minutes, and she didn't skip sessions. But she thought about Voss's letter for the rest of the day. She thought about it the way she thought about the things that mattered. Not obsessively, not with the weight of unresolved feeling, but with the sustained background attention she gave to information that was still teaching her something. What the letter told her was not about Voss. It was about the chain. The thing Reyes had said 2 years ago, "Take it somewhere, it can be seen," was not a single instruction about a single moment. It was a description of a process. You take the thing somewhere, it can be seen, and someone who sees it takes it somewhere else, and the chain extends in directions you can't predict from where you're standing. Reyes had taken what she built in the classified program to Ware's staff, and then to this role, where she had on one evening found the precise entry point for the conversation that unlocked Voss. Voss had taken the unlocking to her range and cleaned the 5th target. And now Voss's letter was sitting on Sarah's desk, and Sarah was carrying something from it forward into her afternoon session that she hadn't had when she woke up that morning. That was what the chain looked like from the inside. She ran her afternoon session hard. When it was over and she was reviewing her data, Trent appeared at the edge of the range. He had the manner of someone who had specifically come to find her, which meant the visit had a purpose that he hadn't communicated in advance. "Walk with me," he said. They walked. "Ware wants to see you at 0800 tomorrow," Trent said. Formal. Formal meant the conference room, the full staff documentation. It meant something was happening that required the official record to be present. "What's the subject?" Sarah asked. Trent looked at her sideways. "Hayes has submitted a formal proposal to the training authority, a revised curriculum for the ACAA preparation program, based on the consultation materials." Sarah processed this. How formal. Signed by Hayes, countersigned by Thorne, submitted to the Institutional Training Board last week. A pause. It went to review this morning. Ware received a copy 2 hours ago. Sarah stopped walking. Trent stopped beside her. How significant is it? She asked. The proposal recommends revising the foundational decision-making framework for precision training across 3 program levels, Trent said. Not just the ACAA preparation, the entry-level curriculum, the advanced curriculum, and the instructor certification track. He paused. Hayes is proposing that the failure as data framework and the trust versus performance of trust distinction be formally incorporated as foundational training elements at all 3 levels. Sarah stood with this. He's changing the whole structure, she said. He's proposing to, Trent said. The board still reviews it, but Hayes's proposals don't generally fail at the board level. He has currency there. Another pause. He also attached a written statement to the proposal. Ware has the full document. But she told me the statement begins with a description of what he called, and I'm quoting from her summary, the most significant single assessment event he had witnessed in 11 years of running the ACAA program. Sarah started walking again. He named the 5th target, she said. He named the entire day, Trent said. The preliminary rounds, the alternate sequence, the 5th target. And then he named what happened in the consultation. Specifically, he named what you said to Voss. Sarah was quiet. He included Voss, she said. He described the moment you opened with failure instead of the technical framework, Trent said. He wrote that it was the most important pedagogical decision he had observed in 22 years of instruction, and that it reordered his understanding of what instruction was for. He paused again. His words, Denise said, verbatim. They reached the end of the corridor and turned. What does Ware want at 0800? Sarah asked. To brief you on the proposal before it goes to public review, Trent said, and to ask you something she hasn't told me the content of, which means it's significant enough that she's managing the information. Sarah filed this. Is Hayes going to be there? She asked. No, Trent said. This is internal. But Sarah. He stopped walking again. She stopped with him. Hayes also submitted a personnel recommendation to Thorne's office. Separate from the curriculum proposal, a recommendation regarding a specific officer's suitability for an instructional leadership role in the revised program. She looked at him. He recommended me, she said. He recommended you, Trent said. With a written statement that Ware described as the most complete personnel endorsement she has read in her career. The weight of this arrived not dramatically, but with the specific density of something real. Not a performance of weight, actual weight. The kind that required a moment to receive correctly. She had come to Fort Raven as a participant in an assessment. Hayes had spent the morning of that assessment publicly questioning whether she belonged. And now, 3 months later, he had submitted a formal proposal to revise the foundational framework of military precision training and attached her name to an instructional leadership role in its implementation. He's not a man who does things halfway, Trent said. Whatever he decides completely. No, Sarah said. He's not. They walked back in silence for a moment. What are you thinking? Trent asked. I'm thinking about the 5th target, she said. He looked at her. Not the engagement, she said. The design. Hayes designed that pattern to expose something he believed existed in my performance, a limit where preparation ended and the gap of real experience began. He designed it with full sincerity. He believed in the test. She paused. And when the test didn't produce what he expected, he didn't discard the test. He discarded the assumption behind it. She looked at Trent. That's not nothing. That takes something that most people don't have. What does it take? Trent asked. It takes valuing the truth more than the explanation you already had for it, she said. Trent was quiet for a moment. You respect him, he said. I respected him from the beginning, she said. I just wasn't sure he was going to respect the data when it disagreed with him. She paused. He did. The 800 the following morning arrived with the particular quality of mornings that are carrying something significant, not the artificial weight of anticipated drama, but the real weight of decisions that were going to matter for a long time. The conference room held Ware Trent Reyes and the two other senior staff members. Sarah sat at her position at the table and noted that no one in the room had the manner of people waiting for something to unfold. They all already knew what was in the proposal. Ware had briefed them before this meeting. What this meeting was for was the conversation after the briefing. Ware set the proposal document in front of Sarah. "Read the executive summary and Hayes' statement," she said. "Take the time you need." Sarah read. The executive summary was clear and well constructed. Hayes wrote with the same deliberate precision. He spoke with no ornamentation, no hedging specific language for specific ideas. The curriculum revision was substantial. It restructured the foundational elements of the precision training track in ways that would require significant instructor retraining, new assessment protocols, and a revised evaluation framework at all three program levels. It was not a small proposal. It was the kind of proposal that, if approved, would change the shape of a program that had been operating in the same basic form for 11 years. Hayes' personal statement was 11 paragraphs. Sarah read all 11. The first paragraph described the ACAA assessment in objective terms, the same summary he had opened the consultation with. The second paragraph described what he had done with the fifth target and why. He did not soften it. He stated in plain language that he had set non-standard parameters outside the assessment protocol with the specific intention of identifying a performance limit he believed existed. He stated that this was an error in judgment that he had already formally disclosed to the range director and the post commander. He stated it without editorializing. The third paragraph was the one that stopped her. It said, "The outcome of the fifth target engagement was not what I expected. What I expected was evidence that would confirm a framework I had built over 22 years. What I received was evidence that the framework was incomplete. The distinction between those two things is the entire foundation of what I am proposing in this curriculum revision. I had confused the map with the territory. Lieutenant Mitchell did not correct my map. She showed me the territory." She sat with that for a moment. Then she read the remaining 8 paragraphs which built the case for the curriculum revision methodically and completely. The final paragraph ended with a sentence that Ware had quoted to Trent and that Trent had relayed to her, but which landed differently in its full context. What Lieutenant Mitchell gave this program in the consultation was not a technique. It was a foundation. We have been building curriculum on ground that was not fully prepared. This proposal is an attempt to prepare the ground. She set the document down. Ware looked at her. "The board reviews it next month," Ware said. "In the meantime, Hayes' personnel recommendation. I've reviewed it. Thorne has reviewed it. The recommendation is for an instructional leadership role in the revised program effective upon board approval, with a transition period to be negotiated based on your remaining time in the current program." She paused. "I want your response." "What does the role look like?" Sarah asked. "You would co-develop the revised curriculum with Hayes' senior instructors," Ware said. "You would lead the failure framework component, specifically the foundational element you introduced in the consultation. And you would work directly with candidates in the ACAA preparation track who are carrying performance errors in the way Voss was carrying hers." She paused. "Not as a therapist, not as a counselor. As an instructor who understands what those errors actually are and can receive them as data alongside the candidate." Sarah looked at the proposal document. She thought about the entry point. She thought about Reyes on the night before the consultation in the chair beside the desk saying, "Tell her the shame is normal." She thought about Voss's letter on plain paper in careful handwriting, describing what it felt like when the framework was correct and the work was sufficient. She thought about the corporal at the administrative desk asking, "How do you do that?" and the answer she had given, and the way the answer had been true, but hadn't been complete because no answer given to a stranger across a counter could be fully complete. The role Ware was describing was the thing that made the answers complete. It was the thing Reyes had pointed toward 2 years ago, and that she had only partly understood at the time. "I'll take the role," Sarah said. No one in the room looked surprised. But something in the room settled the quality of a group of people who have been holding a breath they weren't fully aware they were holding. "There's a condition," Sarah said. Ware looked at her. "Voss," Sarah said. "I want Voss in the program, not as a candidate, as a co-instructor for the failure framework component. She understands what carrying the error feels like from the inside in a way that I can describe but can't fully inhabit anymore. The candidates who come in need both perspectives. They need someone who has moved all the way through the process and someone who has recently moved through it." The room was quiet. Reyes at the far end of the table looked at the surface in front of her and did not visibly react, but the set of her shoulders said something that was not nothing. Ware looked at Trent. Trent said, "Voss is currently assigned to Hayes's unit. The request would go through Hayes." "Hayes submitted the personnel recommendation," Sarah said. "He'll understand the reasoning." Ware was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll contact Hayes this afternoon." Sarah nodded. The meeting wrapped at 9:20. As people gathered their materials, Reyes came to her end of the table. They stood facing each other in the way of people who have covered a long distance together and are standing at the point where the road changes direction. "Co-instructor," Reyes said. "Voss," Sarah said. "You thought about this before this morning." "I thought about your letter," Sarah said. "The one you sent me 2 years ago. About taking it somewhere it can be seen." She paused. "I think Voss takes it somewhere I can't." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You could have asked me," she said. "I have the same recent distance." Sarah looked at her. "You're already doing the thing I'm just starting," Sarah said. "You don't need to go back to it. Voss does." Reyes held her gaze. Then she said, "That's correct." Not simply, not dismissively, with the specific weight of someone acknowledging an accurate assessment of something real. She walked out. Hayes's response to Ware's request about Voss arrived the same afternoon at 16:40. It was a single paragraph. It said, "I have spoken with Lieutenant Voss. She is willing. She is more than willing." She used the word necessary, which I believe is accurate. She will be available for transfer on the timeline required. I want it noted in the official record that this assignment was proposed by Lieutenant Mitchell because the institutional record should reflect where the ideas in this program are coming from. Ware forwarded the response to Sarah without comment. Sarah read it. She sat with it. Then she wrote her own response to Ware, 3 sentences confirming receipt, confirming her readiness to begin the curriculum development work as soon as the board approved the proposal, and requesting that the official record of the program's founding include Hayes's statement in full, because the document that described how the framework had changed needed to include the honest account of what had required changing and why. She sent it and closed the screen. She had a training session in the morning. She had documentation to complete. She had 14 days until the board review and a curriculum framework to begin drafting with Trent in the interim, so that the approval, when it came, could move directly into implementation without delay. She opened her notebook. But before she began writing, something stopped her. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a significant moment announcing itself. Just a pause. The kind that arrives when you are at the edge of the next thing and the last thing is still close enough to touch. She thought about the morning at Fort Raven, the range, the 43 participants, the sound of Hayes's voice asking whether she was the one they called an expert marksman, and the laughter that followed, and the silence she had counted while she walked to the line. She thought about the first target dropping, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth at 98 meters with the variable deceleration pattern, and the 3 seconds of the first cycle and the decision to wait through it. She thought about the corporal at the administrative desk. She thought about Voss's letter. The line, it felt like what it actually was, a correct decision executed correctly, producing a correct outcome. She thought about Hayes at 2200 calling the post commander because he didn't want to wait until morning to put his response on the record. And she thought about something she had never said to anyone, not to Hayes, not to Reyes, not to Ware, or Trent, or Voss, or the corporal at the desk. Something she had never said, because it was the kind of thing that didn't need saying, that existed beneath the level of professional discourse, that lived in the interior space where the actual work happened. She had been afraid on the morning of the final assessment, not of Hayes. not of the fifth target, or the 98 meters, or the non-standard movement pattern. She had been afraid of the simpler thing, the thing that waited underneath all the preparation and all the documented competence and all the classified records that said she was ready. She had been afraid that the preparation was not sufficient, that she had built something that would hold under normal conditions and crack under the specific pressure of that particular moment with those particular witnesses. It was the fear she had described to Hayes as a feeling, fear of the window closing. Fear that she had misjudged the available time. That was the accurate technical description. But underneath the technical description was the older, simpler version. She was afraid that she was wrong about herself. Every shooter on that range had that fear. Every professional in every high-stakes field carried some version of it. The difference was not the absence of the fear. The difference was what you built that was strong enough to stand on when the fear was present. Not to replace the fear. To stand next to it and be taller. That was the thing she had built, not confidence. Confidence was a word that suggested the absence of doubt. What she had built was not the absence of doubt. It was a structure that could bear the weight of doubt without collapsing. She had built it in classified facilities and in failures and in thousands of repetitions nobody had witnessed. She had built it in the second cycle of a target pattern she had never encountered with the window running and the fear present and 60 people watching. She had built it in a debrief room by saying failure first before the technical framework, because she understood that the framework without the foundation was a structure built on doubt, and doubt was not stable ground. And now, she was going to spend the next significant portion of her career teaching other people to build it, not by giving them the finished structure. You couldn't give someone else your structure, it didn't transfer that way. You could only show them the materials and the process and stay present while they discovered that the building was possible. That was what the role was. That was what Voss understood from the inside of having recently built her version of it. That was what the curriculum revision at its core was actually about. Not changing what precision training required, but changing what it assumed. Assuming that candidates came in with doubt, with fear, with the weight of their own expectations, and the expectations of the system, and that those things didn't need to be removed. They needed to be acknowledged, accurately named, and then built around. You didn't remove the doubt. You built taller. She picked up her pen. She wrote at the top of the first clean page foundation what the framework assumes. She wrote for 2 hours. When she stopped, she had the beginning of a document that was not yet a curriculum, but was the thinking underneath one. The kind of thinking that needed to happen before the formal language, before the assessment protocols and the training schedules and the evaluation criteria. The kind of thinking that started by asking not what the training should produce, but what the training needed to understand about the people it was working with. She read back over what she'd written. It was not complete. It was a beginning, and beginnings were supposed to be incomplete. They were supposed to contain the questions that the body of the work would answer. She had been trained to understand beginnings correctly, not as the evidence of what you didn't know yet, but as the accurate mapping of the territory that remained. She closed the notebook. She checked the time. It was later than she'd thought. The building was quiet, the way buildings go quiet when the working day has ended, and the people remaining in them are the ones who have found in the work itself something that makes the ending of the official day irrelevant. She gathered her materials and prepared to leave. At the door, she stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. There was nothing in the room that required a final look. Nothing she had forgotten, nothing unresolved. The stop was not purposeful. But she stood there for a moment in the doorway with the notebook under her arm and the day's weight settling around her, and she let herself feel the full shape of what had happened since she walked onto a firing range at Fort Raven and heard a room full of people decide they already knew what she was. They had laughed, and she had walked to the line, and she had hit 5 targets in sequence, including one that nobody had told her was coming at a distance beyond the standard maximum with a pattern she had never trained on, and she had hit it, not because she was extraordinary, not because she had a gift that set her apart from human limitation, but because she had done the work, and she had trusted the work, and the work had been sufficient. And in the aftermath of those 5 shots, something had moved in the system that surrounded that range, something institutional and structural and deeply resistant to movement. And it had moved not because of the shots themselves, but because of what the shots made visible. That excellence did not have a fixed appearance, that frameworks built from long experience could be wrong in fundamental ways, and that the willingness to rebuild a framework when the evidence required it was not weakness, but the highest form of professional integrity available to a person who had spent 22 years earning the right to never be questioned. Hayes had earned that right, and he had given it up voluntarily because the evidence was more important than the comfort of keeping it. That was the story that would outlast the scores. That was the thing the corporal at the administrative desk would carry forward from the conversation at the checkout counter, and that Voss would carry from the letter on plain paper, and that Reyes had already been carrying for 2 years, since the night she sat across a table in an unnamed facility and said, "Take it somewhere it can be seen." Sarah walked out into the corridor. She walked the length of it to the exterior door. She pushed it open. The night air arrived clean and complete. She stood in it for one breath. Then she walked toward her quarters with the notebook under her arm and the curriculum waiting in the morning, and the full, unambiguous knowledge that she had not come to Fort Raven to be believed in. She had come to do the work, and the work had spoken for itself, and it would keep speaking through Voss, through the revised curriculum, through every candidate who came into Hayes's program and was told for the first time that the fear was normal, and the shame was not a verdict, and the failure was data, and the trust was buildable long after the scores were archived, and the observation area was empty, and the name on the ACAA record was just a number in a file. She had walked to the line when they laughed. She had hit 5 perfect shots when no one believed she would, and she had taken everything that made those shots possible and put it in someone else's hands so the chain would extend further than she could see from where she was standing. That was the job. That had always been the job. And she had done it completely.